Thank you. Morning, everybody. I didn't realise it was going to be such a big crowd. So I know this is a topic that generates an awful lot of debate. And what I'd like to do, especially because it's such a small group, is make sure we have time to address the questions that you may have directly. So I'm only going to speak for about 10 minutes this morning. I've got 3 sides, keep it nice and simple. And then what I'd like it to be is really interactive and for you to ask me questions on my experience, maybe share some of the frustrations, difficulties, challenges that you've got at the moment, and I'll try and provide some perspective there. So as Faye said, I've spent over 20 years in general management, procurement roles. I've managed, led, and been a customer of many strategic relationships, some good, some bad, some failing, and some utterly broken. And so I've been through the mill, been in your shoes, and what I wanted to share today were the learnings that I've had, the things that work, the things that don't work. Share those with you that will help you through the entirety of a strategic sourcing process. So from the outset, the design and development of the operating model, through supplier selection, through negotiation and contract, into transition, and then when you're managing a relationship, how do you not only manage to the contract outputs, but how do you go beyond that? So how do you develop a relationship that truly delivers the business outcomes that are needed and a dynamism that is constantly increasing within businesses and within relationships? How do you create that agility and flexibility so you're not responding to change, but you're driving change? So the best place to start when we talk about how do you optimize strategic relationships is to look at why they fail. There's lots of reasons why they fail, there's lots of symptoms, but research and painful experience will tell you that it typically comes back to these 6 areas. So the first one is around strategic and operational misalignment. Nobody goes into a relationship wanting it to fail. As you go through the due diligence process, you think you've done all of the work to really understand that both parties are aligned on the outcomes and the objectives. What happens post-contract all too often is that 2 parties work separately and you lose that context and perspective of what's really happening within the business, the broader function, or the broader industry. And I've seen it all too often where I've gone into companies where there's an existing relationship, be it a joint venture or a normal outsourcing relationship, and the supplier is not allowed to sit around the table of the particular function to understand contextually what's happening, what's changing. And as you know, the day a contract is signed, it's out of date because the business moves on. So if you're keeping people at arm's length, you're going to end up with strategic and operational misalignment. You deliver things that say green in terms of metrics, you present it to your customers, and your customers say, it doesn't look green to me, it doesn't feel green. And you lose customers. So there's always a mismatch, typically, between very prescriptive contracts and KPIs and the reality of what business is experiencing. So we tend to call that the watermelon effect, where everything looks green, but on the inside it's glaring red. This piece around prescriptive and suffocating contracts is really a very serious issue when you look at managing strategic relationships. A lot of work goes into these huge tomes contracts that run to many, many pages, and people constantly refer back to, let's see what the contract says. Okay? Relationships are governed by contracts that are put in place, but they shouldn't be managed on a day-to-day basis by those contracts. And any time you're in a relationship where you keep having to go back to see what the contract says, you will fail. And we'll talk about that in terms of the behaviors and culture that you need to put in place. When I was at AstraZeneca, we exited a major relationship that we had with IBM, sole source relationship, premeditated on service effect. The contract that was in place that I inherited had won awards in legal circles. It was held up to be one of the best contracts that had ever been put in place. It was an utter disaster. The business struggled, IBM struggled, we struggled, and in the end we fell out. And yet if you'd looked at the beginning of that contract, the beginning of that relationship, you would have said it was set up for success. But the contract was overly prescriptive and very, very hard and disconnected from the realities of operating. Weak integration, ineffective governance. People stay at arm's length. They don't integrate into the team. We talked a little bit about that. Lack of agility and flexibility. again, as you go forward, business needs will continue to change. If you've got a very prescriptive contract, that makes that change difficult. Financial performance, it's a very thorny subject and topic for an awful lot of people. People don't like to talk about it. If you're talking about cost, it's very tactical. But cost is actually the savior of many relationships if it's done transparently. And there is a difference between cost and margin. So when Faye said I've taken a lot of cost out of organizations, I have. But that doesn't mean that I've trampled all over suppliers' operating margins to do it. And we'll talk about how we do this, because fundamentally, this is at the heart of why operationally you see a fall away in service, you see a lack of investment, you see people moving off of the account. Why did the A team go? Because a CFO is looking at the business case that was put together by a provider. If the performance isn't matching the pro forma, then things are going to change. If you don't have transparency, that will happen without you knowing. I had a client recently who told me that they really weren't worried about understanding cost. They had output-based pricing. So it's not my concern. It couldn't be more wrong. On the one hand, you can have a situation where on output-based pricing, you've got the supplier making too much money. The more worrying side from a risk management perspective is where they're not making enough money. And you don't understand the drivers, you don't understand how to influence that, you don't understand how to make changes. That manifested itself in another relationship I had, where we had an aging asset base. Contractually, the supplier was meant to refresh the assets. They didn't, because the pro forma wasn't meeting the reality. Our service started to fall over. It was a service-based contract, output-based contract, so we weren't close enough to it. By the time we got close enough to it, it was too hard to remedy. And culture and behaviors, typically where you lose trust in a relationship and people stop talking to each other and they hold information back, that's the beginning of the end. So at any point in a sourcing relationship, strategic relationship, you'll be at one of these 4 points. How do we set up for success? How do we remediate, and will it really work? How do we accelerate and optimize performance? And when and how is the right time to decide that we need to exit this relationship? You'll always be at one of those 4 points. Recognize it and be clear, direct, and decisive and make a decision. Too many people start out with good intentions. They realize it's going wrong, but they do nothing and expect that performance will improve and things will get better. They don't. They only ever get worse. So there is a need to be very challenging, be very direct, and accept that challenge back from your suppliers as well as a client. So for me, the final slide before we get into some dialogue is these are the 4 performance pillars that I see underpinning strategic relationship performance. And this is as true for shared centers, which I've run before, any service delivery organization. Operational and commercial activities and transparency. There's a lot that sits behind this, but I'll give you some insight at a high level. Culture and behaviors and capabilities. So if you look at operational transparency, this is about making sure that you're providing that clarity around the vision that you have, the strategy, how you're going to work, how that translates into changing context, bringing a supplier to the table. So when we moved away in AstraZeneca from IBM, we went to a multi-source relationship. We had all of our new suppliers sit as an integral member of the management and leadership team. So they sat around the table with me once a month as we looked at what was the IT strategy for AstraZeneca. And to do that, we had to understand what the strategy was for the different parts of the business. That context is really important because it provides clarity for the supplier working with you to make sure that you can deliver for the end customers. The other piece around operations is to make sure that you're very clear on structure and on governance, responsibility, accountability, and authority through all of the processes at a high level, executive level, at a management level, at a day-to-day level. Make sure those accountabilities and responsibilities are very, very clear. Put in place operational rigor. Now that requires a level of transparency, which again, a lot of people shy away from because they feel it's micromanagement. I've engaged an outsourced partner to work with me. It's their responsibility to manage to an output that I expect. That is their responsibility, but your responsibility in overseeing it within the retained organisation is to understand where the control points are, understand the dynamics and the drivers. So service integration and oversight is critically important within this space if you're going to drive operational rigour. The other piece that's important from a transparency perspective when you're trying to optimise performance is to have a jointly owned, prioritised portfolio of improvement activities and aligned investments around it. You can only do that if you've got the right governance in place, because it requires the supplier to come to the table with you and be making those capital plans or revenue plans alongside you against a roadmap that you've jointly laid out. Again, it's something that doesn't happen when there's no trust in the relationship. Commercial is not just about cost, it's about all elements of the financial, so it's about cash flow and it's about investments as well. As I said earlier, cost is not something that should be shied away from. People make mistakes when they develop their proposals for a piece of work that they take on. The business dynamics change. It takes longer. The volumetrics change. You have to understand what's happening and how that influences the cost base of the supplier. If you don't, they'll make changes without you. And that's when you start seeing the customers complain. One of the prerequisites, I think, for a high-performing strategic relationship is to separate cost from margin. So you'll have a procurement group that works and leads that sourcing process and the negotiation and the contracting. You'll end up with a breakdown of what the cost is, even if the pricing mechanism becomes output-based. You'll understand what those costs are, and there's a margin that's agreed on top. Protect that margin for the supplier. Once you're happy with it, protect it. So if you're buying something for $100 or £100 and you've agreed a 10% margin, so $10 or £10, protect that, because then jointly you want to go after the $90 or £90 of cost. But you can only do that if you're very clear that it's not going to come back and hurt their margin. If you do that and agree to share, and I've seen this numerous times, you'll take that $90 of cost down to 60, 70. Then that's good for you as an organisation. It doesn't hurt the supplier because it's true cost, not margin. And if you've protected the $10 as a relative percentage, their profit margin's actually gone up. And you can share that benefit back across. So now you have complete alignment around cost not being a threat, but something that you should jointly go after, because then it drops directly into the investment bucket. How do you accelerate the investments needed to drive transformation? So cost shouldn't be shied away from. In terms of culture and behaviours, this is about one team, having trust, having honesty, being challenged, creating a passion and belief around the way that you work. A lot of strategic relationships fail because of the way they were put together. If you look typically at the evaluation criteria when you've deselected and you're down to your final two providers, it's all about financials, it's all about capabilities, it's all about experience and reference visits. Too many people put too little store against a cultural fit. Because we all know, especially when times get tough, performance is driven by people, not by companies. So what are the operating principles that you want in place and the behaviours that you want to be in place to drive performance? You want the customer to come first and the contract to come second. You don't want a supplier or provider or somebody in the relationship saying, I understand the business has stopped, but we have a change control process for this, and once we've completed that, which is bureaucratic and takes 10 days, we'll get back to the business. That unfortunately happens with an awful lot of relationships. So spend the time to really understand what kind of cultural fit do you want, what are the behaviours, and test in the due diligence that the supplier's actually worked on that basis with other people. And the last one is capabilities. All too often you hear, where did the A-team go? I've got too much attrition on the account, knowledge transfer, I'm having to bring people up the learning ladder. I mean, we're in an HR forum. It shouldn't be a surprise. This is going to happen. It happens in every single strategic relationship that people move on. Nobody wants to work on an account for 3 years doing the same thing. People are individuals. They want to develop their career, so that's going to happen. Recognize it, embrace it, and plan for it. So how do you do succession planning? How do we manage knowledge transfer? Where does that sit? What capabilities do we need in the future? Are they going to be in-house or are they going to be with our partner? How are we going to attract, recruit, develop and retain those capabilities? Do we look at opportunities for secondment to be able to move people between the service provider and the client to get a better understanding of how the organizational dynamics work? That's incredibly powerful. We've done that a number of times. So understanding capabilities, what it looks like at a relationship level, what it looks like at a personal level, and what it looks like at a corporate level is really important. So, went through it very, very quickly, but these 4 performance pillars underpin every strategic relationship at every single stage. When you think about risk management, categorize it against these 4 areas. When you think about how you put a contract together, it's these 4 areas. When you think about how you drive performance on a day-to-day basis and how do you accelerate the transformation that you want through a relationship, you've got to balance across these 4 areas. Okay, so that was a very quick overview. I wanted to keep it fairly short and brief because I wanted to understand from each of you what you're going through, questions you may have, and I'm very happy to answer them.
Hi, thanks. Gary Madden from BP. I think one of the things here is transparency, right, between provider and buyer, and particularly in HR. You know, I've worked for several companies that have done this. It's difficult to get that transparency. So me as the buyer showing this is my business case, the provider saying here's mine and here are my margins.
Yep.
So it works pretty well in finance where it's a transactional based pricing or maybe even RPO. So, you know, how do we manage to get that transparency, because it still doesn't seem to be there in a lot of the cases, at least in HR outsourcing deals?
Yeah. Why do you think it is from either a service provider or a client perspective? What's the fear?
I think it's absolutely about building the relationship and the trust, and when you do that, it comes. But sort of from day one, it doesn't seem to be there, and you've got to work at it,
Yeah.
But it should be the norm.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and it's true in an awful lot of relationships, not just HR. If you go through the FAO or R&D or sales and marketing, you see it in every relationship. So fundamentally, I think when you have the opportunity, when you're starting out in a sourcing exercise, you have to be very, very clear on your principles up front. So you want full transparency through cost, but you want the supplier, the same as you want to deliver on your business case, you want them to make money, because if they don't make money, you're not going to be an attractive account. You won't, back to capabilities, get the very best team, and you will suffer over time. So you have to understand their pro forma. The risk in showing the pro forma is the protection of margin. So you have to create an atmosphere which says, I'm not going after that margin. That's, as I said, you have to red circle that margin and say, actually going forward, all I'm interested in, because I've agreed that baseline price, is managing cost and then taking costs down. That's good for both of us. And when you incentivize that relationship by saying potentially you'll share, and I've put agreements in place before where we'll do that on an 80-20 basis or 70-30 basis, depending on how quickly you think you can take cost out, you see a whole set of different behaviors. The challenge then is you might have transparency and alignment between the buyer and the supplier. The CFO and the buyer, when they change and they come in and they look at it and say, well, why are you paying the supplier a 15% margin? It should be 10. You have to go through the explanation of, yes, but it's 15 of a much lower cost, and forget about benchmarking the market. We've done this, and we haven't gone through an aggressive risk-based change initiative. So it is behaviors, it's setting out the principles, it's living to them. When you have situations where the costs go up, you have to manage them together. You have to do some value engineering exercises where you relook at process. You understand, was it just a poor assumption? Did something change? Or was it a lack of due diligence on the supplier behalf or the buyer behalf? each situation is different, but when you have those principles in place, it will change behaviours.
Hi there, Katrina Hutchinson-O'Neill. I'm Head of Resourcing at RBS. I'm just wondering, do you feel that a segmented supply model, whether that's broken down by region or labour type, is a blocker to a supplier becoming a truly strategic partner?
No, I don't think so. I mean, typically when you work through the design of your sourcing strategy, you understand how does it deliver for the end user in the very best way. So you're evaluating both the dynamics within your business, but also the capability of the suppliers. And in some instance, a global solution doesn't make sense. It doesn't bring economies of scale. It doesn't cover the practices. It doesn't cover the language set. And the worst thing you can do is go for a global relationship. So you may segment it on a geographic basis, local, regional, global. You may do it on a business unit basis. Once that design has been put in place, it doesn't lessen the strategic nature of the relationship with the supplier. What you're effectively working through then is what I would term an ecosystem. So you might have 4 regional suppliers for payroll, as an example. But you'd still bring those 4 suppliers together because fundamentally what you're trying to drive is a level of consistency and standardization. But from either a supplier or demand perspective, you had to segment it. But what you want is their collective input in how do we do this better and what does the future look like. So you can put in place collaboration agreements where everybody feels strategic on their own, but you actually get that much greater strategic synergy at a higher level. Does that make sense?
Hi, I'm Richard King from Procter & Gamble. I was interested in what you were saying about the IBM relationship at AstraZeneca. Obviously, there must have been, I'm sure you came in and thought, gosh, this is broken. You obviously went through some kind of process to reach the conclusion of, do I cut it or do I find a way to make it work? Can you bring that alive a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I moved over into the CIO position about 3 years ago and inherited a very full desk. And a lot of the issues were actually not related to this IBM relationship, but it created a myth and lore amongst the business that everything was the fault of IBM. And it wasn't just IBM, it was IBM and AstraZeneca. People were blaming their children's homework on IBM. So we sat down and we looked at what were the fundamental issues, why it wasn't working. And they're all factual, they're all operational driven. So we had a lack of proactive monitoring. We had no preventative maintenance. We had no deep root cause permanent corrective actions. We had a lack of transparency. The other piece that we had, once we sat down and explored these operational issues, was as a way of trying to remediate our way through this, a response from IBM which said, but we're losing money. So I sat with them and said, well, I don't want you to lose money. So let's understand your pro forma, where you are today, and the areas where you're losing money. We can do one of 2 things. We can re-engineer the processes, or I'll take them away from you. And I'll give them to somebody else, so you're only left with the areas where you make money. So open the books and show me. And they said no. So I said, well, I can't believe you're losing money if you don't show me. So we'd gone through a remediation process, both on an operational level and then on a commercial level, and it wasn't going to work. So the relationship was at a point where we knew we had to break it. The other reason why the performance had been so bad is our operating model within AstraZeneca was broken. It was one size fits all. We'd gone with one single supplier, didn't have the capability. Whether you were a scientist in R&D or you were a salesperson on the road or you were sitting in finance in the head office, you got treated the same way. And our business isn't like that. So we had to create an operating model with different user profiles. We had to understand how we delivered services separated by networks and hosting and end user computing and service desk. And the best way for us to do that was to put together a new operating model with a sourcing strategy that had multi-vendor sourcing. We also brought back in-house a control element around service integration, which was key for us. One, to be agnostic to future sourcing, but also because it gave us control over the strategic and major areas of operational insight. So we brought that in-house. We exited the relationship. We went through a long transition. I say long, painful transition, but in a short space of time. And we were in a far better position. Exiting that relationship terrified everybody within IT as well as at the board level, but it was the right thing for us to do. And sometimes you'll have situations where change is the last thing you want to do. The supplier goes around you, goes to the board, a lot of scaremongering. You have to be very, very clear on why it's not working, what you did to fix it, and why you're making the change.
Okay, so you still had the dynamic where IBM wanted to retain the business?
No.
Or
no.
in this one they were saying, hey, happy
No,
to
well, they wanted to retain the business, but on their terms.
Right.
So we just made it completely objective and said, the last thing we want to do is to change. It's the last thing we want to do. Believe me, you never want to move data centers if you're ever asked to. But we sat down and said, this is what we need for the business. Now, we're prepared to do it with you, but there's some principles in place for us to be able to do that. We have to make sure you have the right capabilities. We have to make sure that we have transparency at an operational and commercial level. And they said, no, we don't work that way. I said, well, that's fine. We do, and now we're at a point where we have to part ways. So we actually exited before the end of the contract, and we worked through and negotiated our way through that. But as I said on one of the earlier slides, know the right time to do it. It will always be tempting and feel like less risk to continue to pursue a path of improvement, but sometimes it's the most high-risk path.
Thank you.
Anyone with a last question? Oh, great.
Hi, Ronald Kreuger from Allegiance. I see it less and less, but in the past we were in contract negotiations, and we encountered questions from clients about penalties. Are you willing, to put your fee at risk? Are you willing to put penalties in? What is your experience and thoughts about penalties or rewards?
Yeah, I mean, I think what people are trying to strive to is a level of accountability and ownership. But you can put that, as I said earlier, you can put that into a contract, but it can never be executed upon because the governance and ways of working in the relationship are such that you'll never be able to avoid it or proactively manage through it. I was with a client a few weeks ago, and they actually had service credits as a line on their P&L. So it was an income statement for them. Yeah. If you're basing hitting your budget on the fact that your supplier is failing, something is very seriously wrong. So I'm not a big fan of service credits and service penalties because I think it drives the wrong behavior. It makes people lazy. The reason you see this with continuous improvement in the middle is if you've got joint line of sight and eyes on what's happening, it should never be an issue because it's root cause analysis. If something's failing, is it failing because it's different than how you'd envisaged, in which case fix it, remediate it, and get it in the contract as a way of working. If it's a one-off, then you manage it as a one-off. But one of the issues with that particular IBM relationship was a lack of proactive monitoring. And that's something that has to be a joint accountability. If you've got a relationship where there's no trust, and I've seen this all too often, a supplier takes it on themselves and says, I'm going to fix this before the client knows about it. And when they fail to fix it and they bring it forward and say it's an issue, they get slapped. And the customer's upset because they didn't know about it. You've got to get to a point where it's okay to bring it forward and say, this is an issue. We're working on it, but we want you to be aware of it, and can you help us together? Because I'll tell you from my experience, the worst scenario ever to be in is where someone comes too late for you to do anything about it. But cultural fit works both ways. Another client I was recently working with on the service provider side, I told them to no bid a proposal from a client. They were the incumbent, they were looking to grow the scope of the relationship. But the piece of work that they had at this point in time, the behaviors were so adversarial and closed that it would have been a disaster for them to go and just compound that by having more. So you have to be selective on both sides.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now in terms of your new
Sure.
venture, please?
So I decided to move on from AstraZeneca for a number of reasons, but primarily because I have a passion for driving transformational performance through strategic relationships. So with the background that I've got in procurement, we help a lot of organizations, large and small, through the transformation of their procurement groups. You know, moving away from a tactical focus purely on cost reduction to really understanding how do you bring value through to the business at large. So how do you drive innovation? How do you harness the power of the relationship? How do you deconstruct the way that the organization works, which then takes you into a broader strategic sourcing field of work, which is around outsourcing, or it's insourcing, or all of the above with shared service centers. A big part of what we're doing at the moment, though, is coming in and helping companies remediate relationships that don't work, or don't work as they should. And we're doing that, again, for service providers and for clients. What's interesting is there's a very clear divide between the definition of an underperforming account. So with certain organizations, an underperforming account is one where you're frustrated that you're not delivering all of the value that you want for the other party. On another side, when I speak with certain people, it's all because they're not making enough money on the account. That's headed for disaster if that's your primary driver. So it's something that I'm fascinated by. I think it can make a real difference to organizations. A lot of people struggle with it, and with the experience that I've had, and Sam, who's here, and other members of the team have had, we're able to come in and engage in a very practical, pragmatic, and proven experience to help make a difference. So this isn't conceptual. We've been there, we've done it in some very messy and difficult situations.